So wonderful to be here, and I'd like to particularly thank the University of Hong Kong and RMIT University for running such a prestigious event. And I'd like to thank the co-chairs of the meeting, that's Professors May Hasham, Daniel Barr and Lex Buter. And a special thank you and a cheerio to Professor Callum Drummond for facilitating the invitation for me to speak. Looking around the room today, I am reminded that research is a truly human pursuit. It thrives on face-to-face connections. It's easy to forget that when you're a student and it's late at night and you're the last person left in the lab again. So, every so often, it's worth pausing to remember just how many people are out there working hard, gathering data, just like you. Worldwide, there are more than 8 million researchers, and every year the world produces another 250,000 PhDs. China alone has added 1 million researchers to its research workforce since 2011. Now, of course, not all of these researchers will work in academia, but those who do are highly productive. They publish in the order of 4 million academic journal articles every year, spread across more than 40,000 journals. And all of that traffic is routed through a single critical bridge. I'll call it the publication process bridge. And I want you to picture that bridge. We know it so well. It stood there for centuries. And in that time, it has developed from a simple footbridge with a handful of pedestrians into a triple-decker, multi-lane, high-speed monster freeway. And it's fundamentally sound. The basic structure of peer review, well, it's the best process we've ever invented. Every day, I see trucks on that bridge carrying outcomes that even Einstein thought would never arrive. The detection of gravitational waves, devices that can translate brain signals into speech, atomic clocks that can mark a second with precision in the parts per quintillion. This great bridge that holds up civilization has served us well. It's not about to collapse, but it is showing signs of strain. You could start with the fact that there are now more than 20,000 papers that have been retracted and are in the Retraction Watch database. So you have to ask yourself, does that catch 50% of the times that the quality assurance process failed? 10% of the times? We can't say, but we know enough to be concerned. There was the 2015 analysis conducted by the United States Federal Reserve of 67 economics papers published in reputable academic journals. And only a third of the findings could be independently replicated. There was the 2018 analysis of 100 psychology papers, also published in reputable journals. And only 2 in 5 could be independently replicated at the level of significant results. There was the 2015 survey of about 400 statisticians who were asked about their interactions with collaborating researchers. Well, almost half of them had been asked to report results before the data had been cleaned and validated. A quarter had been asked to remove some of the data, and more than 10 of the 400 had been explicitly directed to falsify the statistical significance, and some of them on more than 10 occasions. Whatever your field, you'll have your own examples. Put them together, and we have more than enough evidence to conclude that we cannot write off these lapses as the occasional bit of bad driving. The evidence says we haven't built the optimal bridge. The people who pay for the petrol and rely on the safe delivery of the cargo, those are the taxpayers and the governments, they're no longer prepared to take us on trust. They want actions to shore up the bridge. So we are gathered at this conference to be the civil engineers. Now, I'm an engineer by training. I'm also Australia's chief scientist. And in that capacity, I wanted to understand what we could do to strengthen the bridge. I acknowledge it's an enormous topic. I can't even list all of its dimensions, let alone disentangle them. My focus was practical. What could we do to make a material difference, with a focus on the overarching framework from which other important measures could flow? So in October of last year, I organised a workshop on research quality and the publication process in my office in Canberra. We invited the editor of the Springer Nature Group, Sir Philip Campbell, along with the heads of our research funding agencies, leaders of our research institutions, and experts in the field of publication. The full list of names is available on my office website, along with a subsequent article that was published in Nature. And I want to share with you today some of the practical measures that we considered and how we are pursuing some of them at the national level in Australia. Then I want to turn to the global infrastructure that we would need to consider if we are going to standardise good practices across the world. And in the spirit of fair attribution, let me note that my reflections today are informed by that workshop, but the recommendations are my own. So let me start as our workshop did, and as all engineers are trained to do, and that is to define the problem. The publication bridge, it's fundamentally sound, and I believe it's critical to keep it open. But quality assurance is weakening. We've got trucks arriving with rotten cargo that has to be retracted. Sometimes, but not that often, we've got trucks arriving with contraband cargo and forged transit documents. We've got trucks arriving with useless cargo that nobody wants to purchase. And we've got drivers speeding madly to make as many trips as possible. The traffic backs up at the toll gates because the good peer reviewers are overloaded. We've got smugglers, call them predatory publishers, dodging the toll gates entirely. And we've got increasingly frustrated researchers who are looking for alternatives, jumping off the bridge and into the wild waters of open science below. We talk constantly about these problems, and still they remain. All of the participants in our workshop agreed. There are many thought leadership organisations. There are excellent and widely acknowledged guidelines. But all up, that's not enough when the incentives in the system run the opposite way. We know from the mining sector, if the safety incentives are set correctly, the safety record dramatically improves. And we know the opposite from the finance and banking sectors. If the incentives are set incorrectly, then appalling practices prevail. Well, it's exactly the same in research. It doesn't matter how many times we say we want quality over quantity in theory, if we keep rewarding quantity in practice. We've all got to take responsibility for bringing the theory and the practice into alignment. So let's begin by looking first at the people directing the trucks and the drivers, our research institutions. For centuries, we've relied on an apprenticeship model of training, which is just like the way we used to teach our teenagers to drive. You put them in a car with an experienced driver. And that made sense in a world where senior researchers were publishing less frequently and had the time to give to perhaps, say, a handful of students. But it's reckless in a world where there's much less time to give and many more students wanting to share it. And even in my day as a student 40 years ago, the pressures were showing. My PhD supervisor, Professor Stephen Redman, he sat firmly in the school of quality. He averaged about 2 papers per year. He expected a lot of his students, but he was generous with his time. And I realise now just how hard it must have been for Steve to stick to his principles. And almost as if in confirmation, coincidentally, given that I was about to give this talk, 2 months ago, I received an email from one of Steve Redman's contemporaries. And in this email, he expressed that he could recall that every time that he sat on a panel that was assessing Steve, the beauty of Steve's papers was lost in the clamour about his production rate. What you have there was a senior researcher, an acknowledged superstar, conducting research of the highest quality with undeniable impact, decades in the past, under constant pressure to accelerate. Let's just think about the intensity of that pressure on a PhD student and a research supervisor today. How much is that student really going to learn by osmosis? A far more reliable mechanism is explicit instruction, structured, formal teaching in research integrity and professional expectations. It's my opinion that research institutions should make that instruction mandatory, not just in student training programs, but for every one of their existing researchers. And if we're going to put the time into training, then we should have agreed minimum standards for the modules. As a starting point, accredited research integrity courses should probably cover the material from the Singapore Statement and the Montreal Statement that were issued after the second and third World Conferences on Research Integrity. At the same time, we shouldn't expect mentors to be good mentors by instinct. Their institutions should train them in good mentorship and make that training a condition for any post where they are supervising staff. And instead of judging a senior researcher's performance by the number of students on their books, we should ask for impact statements on, say, 2 of their former PhDs, at least one of them female. How were they mentored? And what did they go on to achieve? That's not the only change that I would like to see in an academic CV. Think for a moment about how a so-called competitive CV looks today. Pages and pages and pages of article and authorship credits. No reviewer has the time to evaluate those lists, to gauge the quality, so quantity prevails. Now imagine how it would look in a system that made quality the focus. Well, we would opt for a model such as the Rule of 5. Candidates present their best 5 papers over the past 5 years, accompanied by a description of the research, its impact, and their individual contribution. I have to emphasise the exact number of years or papers that institutions opt to consider isn't important. 5, 8, 10, but on both counts, the number should be small, perhaps anything up to 10. What matters is the emphasis on the significance of the research and the message that it clearly sends. How do you shift the behaviour in research institutions when we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of institutions? Well, there is a principle known as follow the money. And in this case, the money trail from the research institutions leads straight back to the agencies that provide the grants. If we want to motivate change at scale, then those national granting agencies are key. And so my recommendation is that for investigators to be funded by a national granting agency, they should be required to prove that they have undertaken an accredited course in research integrity. And without that proof, the grant would fail to get through the first stage of administrative review. In addition, national granting agencies should evaluate investigators' publication records from a rule of 5 perspective, with total publications and H indices pushed to the background as secondary considerations. Now, I acknowledge that I am building on existing ideas. My ambition is for granting agencies to take the leadership in supporting best quality research beyond the grant itself. One of those agencies is Australia's National Health and Medical Research Council, or NHMRC, which is led by Professor Anne Kelso. If my principle is follow the money, Professor Kelso's principle is use the power of the funder, and do so thoughtfully and deliberately to keep the focus on quality where it belongs. Already, we've seen some significant steps forward. The rule of 5 is now in place for some NHMRC grant schemes, and in future it may well be extended. Further, for 2 of the major schemes, the impact of the investigators' past research is now an explicit part of their track record assessment. Impact, be it on knowledge, on health, on the economy, or on the community. Impact is judged on case studies, not just numbers, explanations. And this is the beginning of the NHMRC's quality agenda. It's not the end. Professor Kelso is looking comprehensively at the NHMRC's role in supporting high-quality research through all of its processes, policies, guidelines, peer review, the lot. They will be working with research institutions to recognise and spread good practice. The expectation is clear. Research institutions have to be more explicit in conveying the message to their research staff that quality counts. To verify the commitment, the NHMRC is calling for regular self-assessment by accountable leaders in research institutions of their institutional policies and reforms. Another notable example is the responsible conduct of research requirement in the United States. Major granting agencies, including the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, require every institution that applies for grants to provide appropriate research conduct training. However, at present, the requirement applies only to postgraduate students and postdoctoral fellows involved in a project. My recommendation, to make grant funding conditional on every investigator providing proof that they have completed a course in research integrity, goes further in recognition of the fact that we aren't just looking to support a new generation. We're still playing catch-up with the generation before, as well as absorbing researchers from countries where the training isn't required. There is some progress. For example, I learned this afternoon from the head of the Irish Health Research Board that they have recently implemented a strict requirement that every investigator be able to prove that they have completed a research integrity training course. It's very recent. And the Wellcome Trust is also implementing broad quality and integrity policies. So, we can see that there are pockets of progress. The bigger challenge remains. How can we scale up and standardise good practice right across the globe? Today, we simply lack the systems for a collective approach. In particular, we lack real oversight over journals. We have seen some jurisdictions take action against the worst of the predatory publishers through fraud law. But the reach of those laws, it's limited. And the standard that we want for journals isn't not criminal. The standard we want is best practice. Journals are not simply players in a knowledge market. They are knowledge custodians with all the prestige and privilege that affords. We have to be united in our expectations. If journals are to retain their position as knowledge custodians, then they have a responsibility to be more than scrupulous. They also have to be accountable and transparent. Now, where exactly a particular journal fits on the continuum between criminal fraud and agreed best practice, well, that's rarely clear. Of course, there are outliers at both ends, but there are tens of thousands of journals in the middle. Now, that's not good for the journals that do commit to best practice because we've got very few ways to verify their claims. It's extremely good for the journals that don't commit to best practice because we've got very few ways to save junior researchers and journalists and even policymakers from being duped. To date, it's fair to say that even reputable journals have not welcomed greater scrutiny. But scrutiny, it doesn't have to come as an imposition. And I'd like to give you an analogy from my own time in industry. I was the founder and the chief executive officer of a company in Silicon Valley called Axon Instruments. We made research instruments, but we also made medical devices, including a product that put an electrode 3 inches deep into human brains during surgery to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Now, no hospital would purchase that product unless they knew it was safe. So we undertook ISO 9000 certification. That's an international quality assurance program, and it's like a superset of good manufacturing practices, the GMP, that is required to register products under the FDA in the United States. The ISO 9000 standards, they are extremely demanding. They apply to the company, the production process, and the product itself. And compliance is verified by a combination of internal and external audits. And to my surprise, I found that as a manufacturer, those standards became my best friend because they told my customers that we were selling a trustworthy product. And they also kept the market clear of low-quality producers who would, first, steal my customers, and second, destroy the whole industry's reputation. So imagine if we had something equivalent for the publication process. And I'm calling it the PPQA, for Publication Process Quality Assurance. Compliance with PPQA would indicate to researchers, to research institutions, and to granting agencies that the journal followed internationally accepted publication guidelines. And granting agencies, in my dream, would only consider research that has been published in a PPQA-compliant journal when judging applications. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. The PPQA is not akin to an impact factor. What I'm talking about is quality assurance, to ensure that journals implement an agreed minimum standard for their publication process. Where would you start? Well, we could start with the guidelines developed by organisations like COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. Higher levels of the PPQA could pick up on the transparency and open promotion guidelines, known as the TOP guidelines, compiled by the Centre for Open Science. Or they could pick up on the reproducibility and replicability in science recommendations published just this year by the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. That's in the United States. All of these guidelines collectively, they form a tremendous body of work by deeply knowledgeable people who have reflected on these issues for many years. So let's use this body of work. So, who would audit and accredit that each journal title meets the standards? Well, it could be an existing body like COPE if they were funded to do so. It could be a new entity created for the purpose. Or, as it happens with the ISO standards, it could be credentialed private companies. However the audit for accreditation is done, we would require a central global body to hold the list of successful journals, open for checking by grant agencies, by institutions, by journalists, by venture capital funders, by everyone. There would obviously be costs. So the inevitable question is, who should pay? Well, turn the question around. Who has a reason to be invested? Journals for one, granting agencies for another, large philanthropic bodies with an interest in high-quality research for a third. Some provision would have to be made to ensure that small society journals are not overburdened by audit costs. Now, all of these questions would require careful deliberation on the model through discussions involving libraries, publishers, granting agencies, and research institutions. And the agreed model that emerged would have to be tested through a pilot to see what works and what might go wrong. And it can't happen without global forums, global bodies with the networks and credibility to speak as the collective voice of science. The International Science Council would be an obvious candidate, as would be the Global Research Council. But what we shouldn't do is just continue and extend the good discussions of the past without a matching commitment to action. And since granting agencies provide the keystone research funding, they have the greatest capacity to push for a shift in behaviour. And they should set a timetable for the deliberations. And finally, my recommendation to the granting agencies is that they should turn the results of the deliberations into actions by setting a date in the future after which new papers can only be included in a grant application if they were published in a journal that is shown to comply with PPQA. Now, as I acknowledged at the beginning, there are many issues wrapped up in research integrity. And all of us will have the opportunity to dive into them this week. But my focus today is on the practical, in the firm conviction that we have a system that is fundamentally sound but can undoubtedly be improved. To recap, Based on the principle of follow the money, these are my 3 recommendations. 1. Granting agencies should make proof of research integrity training a requirement for applying for a grant, applicable to all investigators listed on the application. 2. Granting agencies should require CVs that are submitted for grant review to follow the Rule of 5. And 3, granting agencies should only consider new publications from journals that have proven their compliance with the PPQA, that's the Publication Process Quality Assurance. Ambitious perhaps, but considering the stakes, I would say that a bit of ambition can be excused. And I hope that this is the spirit that we've all brought to this great global gathering today. Think of that bridge this week. It has served us well, but it's creaking under the increased load and the evolving driver behaviours. If it were a physical bridge, no question we would fix it. Well, the research bridge is every bit as critical because we make life and death decisions on the basis of the data that is trucked across. Soldered onto the neural circuits of every engineer is the knowledge that there is always a better way. And we can find that better way to do research. Thank you.